Hello, this is an audiobook of Engels' Synopsis of Capital, which was actually never completed, but there are a couple of notes that he left that were meant to sort of summarize Marx's Capital within newspapers. And I came across actually Engels' introduction to Marx's Wage, Labor, and Capital. And I thought it was actually an excellent introduction to Engels' Synopsis of Capital. So I'm going to read this for you guys, in addition to, and then add it to the beginning of Engels' Synopsis of Capital, my audiobook for that. So let's begin. In the 40s, Marx had not yet finished his critique of political economy. This took place only towards the end of the 50s. Consequently, his work, which appeared before the first part of a contribution to the political economy, differ in some points from those written after 1859, and contain expressions and whole sentences which, from the point of view of the latter works, appear unfortunate and even incorrect. Now, it is self-evident that in ordinary editions intended for the general public, this earlier point of view also has its place as a part of the intellectual development of the author, and that both author and public have an indisputable right to an unaltered reproduction of these older works, and I should not have dreamed of altering a word of them. It is another thing when the new edition is intended practically and exclusively for propaganda amongst workers. In such a case, Marx certainly would have brought the old presentation dating from 1849 into harmony with his new point of view, and I feel certain of acting as he would have done in undertaking for this edition the few alterations and additions which are required in order to attain this object in all essential points. I therefore tell the reader beforehand that this is not a pamphlet as Marx wrote it in 1849, but approximately as he would have done so in 1891. The actual text, moreover, is circulating in so many copies that this will suffice until I am able to reprint, again, unaltered, a complete edition. My alterations turn on one point. According to the original, the worker sells his labor to the capitalist for wages. According to the present text, he sells his labor power. So what's the difference between labor and labor power? Labor power is an abstraction from labor. It's somebody's ability to do work. Labor is your actual work itself. Why is this abstracted, right? So you go to your boss, you're getting hired, right? You're filling out the application. What is he hiring you based on? Is he hiring you based on your labor right there, like the work you're doing right there, or your ability to do work? Is that what sets the wage? Just your ability to do work. And this ability to do work, perceived ability to do work, is what the market then uses, right, within certain fields, within certain yada yada, using this, using that about your individual self, but also the market as a whole, your education level, yada yada, to determine wages, to determine value, to determine this, to determine that. So that's why it needs to be abstracted. And for this alteration, I owe an explanation. I owe it to the workers in order that they may see that it is not a case of mere juggling with words, but rather one of the most important points in the whole of political economy. I owe it to the bourgeoisie so that they can convince themselves how vastly superior the uneducated workers, for whom one can easily make comprehensible the most difficult economic analyses, are to our supercilious, quote-unquote, educated people, to whom such intricate questions remain insoluble their whole life long. Ooh, shots fired. Ooh, shots fired. You know, he's basically calling bourgeois economists like dumbasses. You know, like that's it. He's just saying, you guys broke, you guys fucking dumbasses. You know, your so-called uneducated workers are going to be able to understand this shit so much better than you are, and you, dear listener, are that stupid uneducated worker. Classical political economy took over from industrial practice the current conception of the manufacturer, that he buys and pays for the labor of his workers. This conception had been quite adequate for business's needs, the bookkeeping and price calculations of the manufacturer. But naively transferred to political economy, it produces there really wondrous errors and confusions. Economics observes the fact that the prices of all commodities, among them also the price of the commodity that it calls labor, are continually changing, that they rise and fall as the result of the most varied circumstances, which often bear no relation whatever to the production of the commodities themselves, so that prices seem, as a rule, to be determined by pure chance. As soon, then, as political economy made its appearance as a science, so this is like when economics was born, one of its first tasks was to seek the law which was concealed behind this chance, apparently governing the prices of commodities, and which is in reality governed by this very chance. Within the prices of commodities continually fluctuating and oscillating, now upwards, now downwards, political economy sought for the firm central point around which these fluctuations and oscillations turned. In a word, it started from the prices of commodities in order to look for the value of commodities as a law of controlling prices. The value which all fluctuations in prices are to be explained, and to which initially they are all to be ascribed. So what he's saying is that bourgeois economists were working backwards, right? They looked at prices to explain value. Well, value is something underlying prices that prices typically oscillate around. And so all their explanations are essentially pretty shitty because they're very surface value about evaluations of capitalism and observations of capitalism that don't go as deeper as Marx did, which Marx worked backwards, right? They worked from the surface of capitalism. Marx worked the other way. Classical economics then found that value of a commodity is determined by the labor contained in it, requisite its production. With this explanation, it contented itself. And we also can pause here for the time being. I will only remind the reader, in order to avoid misunderstandings, that this explanation has nowadays become totally inadequate. Marx was the first thoroughly to investigate the value-creating quality of labor, and he discovered in so doing that not all labor apparently or even really necessary for the production of a commodity adds to it under all circumstances a magnitude of volume which corresponds to the quantity of labor expended. If therefore today we say offhandedly with economists like Ricardo, who's a famous classical economist, that the value of a commodity is determined by the labor necessary for its production, we always, in doing so, imply the reservations made by Marx. This suffices here. More is to be found in Marx's A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859, and the first volume of Capital. But as soon as the economist applied his determination of value by labor to the commodity, quote-unquote, labor, they fell into one contradiction after another. How is the value of labor determined? By the necessary labor contained in it. But how much labor is contained in the labor of a worker for a day, a week, a month, a year? The labor of a day, a week, a month, a year, if the labor is the measure of all values, then indeed we can express the quote-unquote value of labor only in labor. But we know absolutely nothing about the value of an hour of labor if we only know that it is equal to an hour of labor. This brings us not a hair's breadth nearer to the goal. We keep on moving in a circle. And this is the problem, right? They don't go underneath to actual value. They stick to price. And this is the problem with modern-day bourgeois economists. And this is how, for example, crashes keep on happening. They're unbeknownst, unseen before crashes, and crashes should not happen. And, every single time, these economists are freaking out. Why is this happening? Why is this happening? Classical economics, therefore, tried another track. It said, the value of a commodity is equal to its cost of production. But what is the cost of production of labor? In order to answer this question, the economists have to tamper a little with the logic. Instead of investigating the cost of production of labor itself, which unfortunately cannot be ascertained, they proceeded to investigate the cost of production of the worker. And this can be ascertained. It varies with time and circumstance, but for a given state of society, a given locality, and a given branch of production, it too is given, and at least within fairly narrow limits. We live today under the domination of the capitalist production, in which a large, ever-increasing class of the population can live only if it works for the owners of the means of production, the tools, machines, raw materials, and the means of subsistence in return for wages. On the basis of this mode of production, the cost of production of the worker consists of that quantity of the means of subsistence, or their price in money, which on the average is necessary to make him capable of working, keep him capable of working, and replace him after his departure by reason of old age, sickness, or death, with a new worker, that is to say, to propagate the working class in the necessary numbers. Let us assume that the money price of these means of subsistence averages 3 marks a day. So, dollars, marks is dollars in this sentence. Our worker, therefore, receives a wage of 3 marks a day from the capitalist who employs him. For this, the capitalist makes him work, let's say 12 hours, by calculating roughly as follows. Let us assume that our worker is a machinist, has to make a part of a machine which he can complete in 1 day. The raw material iron and brass in the necessary previously prepared form costs 20 marks. The consumption of coal by the steam engine and the wear and tear of the same engine, of the lathe and the other tools which our worker uses, represent for 1 day, and reckon by his share of their use, the value of 1 mark, so like the energy use in production. The wage for 1 day, according to our assumption, is 3 marks. So this is like how much value the worker produced. This makes 24 marks in all for a machine part. But the capitalist calculates that he will obtain on average 27 marks from his customers in return, or 3 marks more than his outlay. Whence came the 3 marks pocketed by the capitalist? According to the assertion of the classical economies, commodities are, on the average, sold at their values, that is, at prices corresponding to the amount of necessary labor contained in them. The average price of our machine part, 27 marks, would thus be equal to its value, that is, equal to the labor embodied in it. But of course, these 27 marks, 21 marks, were values already present before our machine work began. Remember, it was like the raw materials and stuff like that, and the energy. 20 marks were contained in the raw materials, 1 mark in the coal consumed during the work, or in the machines and tools which were used in the process and which were diminished in their efficiency by the value of the sum. There remained 6 marks which have been added to the value of the raw material. But according to the assumption of our economists themselves, these 6 marks can only arise from the labor added to the raw material by our worker. His 12 hours labor has thus created a new value of 6 marks. The value of his 12 hours labor would therefore be equal to 6 marks. And thus we would at last have discovered what the quote-unquote value of labor is. Hold on there, cries our machinist, 6 marks? But I have received only 3 marks. My capitalist swears by all that is holy that the value of my 12 hours' labor is only 3 marks, and I demand 6. He laughs at me. How could you make that out? If previously we got into a vicious cycle with our value of labor, we are now properly caught in an insoluble contradiction. We looked for the value of labor, and we have found more than we can use. For the worker, the value of 12 hours labor is 3 marks. 3 marks for 12 hours of labor? God damn, they were paying them slave wages back then. I mean, wage slavery. It exists, obviously. Like wage slavery is wage slavery, but still, god damn, they were fucking them over back then. For the capitalist, it is 6 marks, of which he pays 3 to the worker as wages and pockets 3 for himself. Thus, labor would have not 1, but 2 values, and very different values, into the bargain. The contradiction becomes still more absurd as soon as we reduce to the labor time the values expressed in money. During the 12 hours labor, a new value of 6 marks is created. Hence, in 6 hours, 3 marks, the sum which the worker receives for 12 hours labor. For 12 hours labor, the worker receives as an equivalent value the product of 6 hours labor. Either, therefore, the labor has 2 values, of which one is double the size of the other, or 12 equals 6. In both cases, we get pure nonsense. So what he's basically saying is that the worker creates more value than he gets paid. And so there's a part of the workday where the worker is just basically working for his own wages, marks up that necessary labor, and then where he's working for his boss's wages or the profit or whatever you want to call it that the boss will make. Marx call that surplus labor. So this worker, he produced up to 6 marks of value and he only got paid 3. So half of his workday was spent making his own wage, the other half his boss's wage or the capitalist's wage. More to be more accurate, right? Because a boss is just a middle manager. Likewise, within this, Engels is saying where we find the price of labor, and it's basically just the bare minimum for the upkeep of a worker, right? For him to reproduce himself. Because workers are, unfortunately for capitalists, not machines, right? Even though they buy labor power like a commodity, your ability to do work, you need eventually to go home, to go sleep, you need to eventually eat, and you need a roof over your head. And these three necessities, along with the other for your upkeep, is where the price of labor power comes from. And this, again, remember when I was saying your workday is divided into two parts. Necessary labor, right? That's the amount of work you're doing for yourself. So those are the 3 marks you're earning. And then surplus labor, that's the labor that your capitalist is taking. This is necessary labor, right? So this is how the market decides it, right? Just the bare minimum, as much as it can. And of course, this is the most stripped away market. Of course, some people do get paid a little bit more, a little bit yada, a little bit less. But what the market generally tends to do, and what generally tends to happen, is that capitalists are incentivized then, to lower and lower and lower your wages far below your subsistence, your necessary labor. They're incentivized to lower your necessary labor as much as possible and to get as much surplus labor out of you as possible, right? That's a big goal of theirs, right? So more hours of your workday making them money, less hours of your workday making you money. So, your wages go down. And there's many ways they can do that. One of them is to automate the workplace, right? So if humans are contributing less labor and more of it is automatized, right? It's in the form of automatic machines. Machines cannot create value, only humans can, right? So machines are just stores of value. They impart value onto the commodity, but they already use pre-existing value, usually gotten from human labor somewhere else within the system. So they can automatize the system and make you more productive. That can lower your wages, right? Because now you're producing commodities faster and faster and faster. There's less human time involved within creating every single commodity, less socially necessary labor time involved within creating every single commodity. So now the commodities are cheaper, and also now your wage is cheaper. And this is why a big part of Marxist analysis, and it's why it's so prophetic, is that machinery and automation under capitalism, right? What Marx really discovered was that capitalism is automating itself. It's going towards more and more generalized automation of almost every single process. Now, whether or not it'll get full automation or not, we don't know. But automation, what it does is it actually does a tug on the workers, right? More money gets spent on automation than actually hiring out human labor, right? So the formula is constant capital, that's money spent on automation, versus variable capital, that's money spent on hiring human labor. But human labor is the main source of value, right? Human labor is the main source of value, but capitalism is a competition. Okay, so capitalism is a competition. And if you can temporarily lower the value of a commodity, you can sell a lot more of it, right? So if PS5s are usually $500 and you've got a company that's able to shoot out PS5s with an automatic robot at 2 seconds an hour, and the PS5 drops to $10 an hour, even though you're making a lot less, even though the value is a lot less and you're making a lot less money off of it, a lot more people are going to buy it, right? So because of the competitiveness of the market, there's a general trend towards automation, right? But once every single industry across the entire industry, right? Once every single company across the entire industry adopts this new robot that you had, right? This robot that makes PS5s $10, suddenly all PS5s now are $10, right? This rush to buy that one company's PS5s are gone. And so what happens is all this money that would have gone towards hiring out humans, variable capital, has now been put into constant capital. And even though temporarily the market was able to offset this, right? This company was able to offset this loss in profit by selling more, right? Suddenly, everybody across the entire industry has adopted this new technology, so they can't do that anymore. What happens? There's a general trend in a falling rate of profit, and there is a growth in a unemployed amount of people, because now capital has been spent across the entire industry on automating the process, not hiring out human labor. And so in the era of AI, this is called the organic composition of capital, by the way, if you want to search it up. The formula is C divided by V, or it's C divided by V, right? It's constant capital divided by variable capital. It's the amount of capital that you put into machinery versus the amount of capital that you put into humans. And the higher the organic composition of capital goes, the more you see a falling rate of profit, and the more you see unemployed people, because unemployed people are being replaced by machines. And what this essentially has the effect of is a crisis point. And Marx was able to, through this, predict the AI situation that we have right now, where the market is more and more investing in AI and automation and getting rid of job fields. And we haven't quite gotten there yet. We're slowly getting there, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. And more, they're investing in that. And yet less and less in humans. And so right now you're seeing these massive layoffs, Amazon, yada, 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 FedEx, whatever. The job market's not growing at all. And that's because humans, once again, are being thrown out of the market by these new automatons, right? And as they're adopted across the entire industry, there's another falling rate of profit. How do you recover that falling rate of profit, right? You decrease necessary labor. You decrease people's wages so you can get even more surplus value out of them. Right, so this is the way in which capitalism is both trending towards automation and also its own self-destruction. And this is one of the many built-in, the falling rate of profit, one of the many built-in doomsday clocks within capitalism. In addition to other issues like, infinite growth in a finite world, like how the fuck is capitalism going to deal with climate crises? And people like Andrew Yang, and I'm so sorry for this tangent, it's going on for almost 7 minutes, but people like Andrew Yang and UBI, right? And there's a reason why Andrew Yang and UBI are from Silicon Valley. They are more than aware of this. And this is why they constantly propose UBI, Universal Basic Income. And the reason they do is because they are well aware that their entire valley, this bitch-ass Silicon Valley, I fucking hate Silicon Valley so fucking much, bro. I used to live not too far from there, and the people there are, But anyways, they're more than aware that what they're doing right now is their entire industry is trying to replace a constant variable capital, and they're trying to bring it all towards constant capital. They're trying to replace human labor with in a way that's so productive and so profitable with robots and automations and AIs. And this is a crisis that capitalism will have. Like, what are you going to do when millions of people are permanently out of a job? Entire industries are destroyed. And what they are planning on doing is universal basic income. And the problem with universal basic income is that they're going to give you the bare minimum, right, to all these unemployed people just to keep the economy going. The bare minimum, right? So all these people are going to be unemployed, destitute, and they're just going to get the bare minimum, right, to in order to survive. And nothing more and nothing less. And so this really is a ticking time bomb within capitalism. Its tendency towards displacing human labor for automations, and these automations not actually benefiting the majority of humanity, but a capitalist pocketbook. Turn and twist as we will, we cannot get out of this contradiction as long as we speak of the purchase and sale of labor and of the value of labor. And this also happened to the economists. The last offshoot of classical economists, the Ricardian school, was wrecked mainly by the insolubility of this contradiction. Classical economics has gotten into a blind alley. The man who found a way out of this blind alley was Karl Marx. What the economist has regarded as the cost of production of labor, quote-unquote, was the cost of production not of labor, but of the living worker himself. And what this worker sold to the capitalist was not his labor. As soon as his labor actually begins, says Marx, it has already ceased to belong to him. It can therefore no longer be sold by him. At the most, he might sell his future labor, right? So we're getting into the distinction between labor power and labors, right? Labor is the actual work you do. Labor power is your ability to do work. That is to undertake to perform a certain amount of work in a definite time. In doing so, however, he does not sell labor, which would first have to be performed, but puts his labor power at the disposal of the capitalist for a definite time, in the case of the time work, or for the purpose of definite output, in the case of piece work. Piece work is getting paid by piece, right? So like if you're a DoorDash delivery driver, you don't get paid a regular wage, you get paid per delivery. In return for a definite payment, he hires out or sells his labor power. But this labor power is intergrown with his person and inseparable from it. Its cost of production therefore coincides with his cost of production. What the economists called the cost of production of labor is really the cost of production of the worker and there within his labor power. And so we can go back from the cost of production of labor power to the value of labor power and to determine the amount of socially necessary labor requisite for the production of labor power of a particular quality, as Marx has done in the chapter of now buying and selling of labor power. Now, what happens after the worker has sold his labor power to the capitalist, that is, placed it at the disposal of the latter in return for a wage day, wage piece, piece wage agreed upon beforehand? The capitalist takes the worker into his workshop or the factory, where all the things necessary for the work, raw materials, auxiliary materials, coal, dyes, etc., tools, machines are already to be found. Here the worker begins to drudge. His daily wage may be, as above, 3 marks, and in this connection it does not make any difference whether he earns it as a day wage or a piece wage. Here also we assume, again, in the 12 hours the worker by his labor adds new value to 6 marks, to the raw materials used up, which new value of capitalist realizes this on the sale of this finished piece of work. Out of this he pays the worker his 3 marks. The other 3 marks he keeps for himself. If now the worker creates a value of 6 marks in 12 hours, then in 6 hours he creates the value of 3 marks. He has therefore already repaid the capitalist the counter value of 3 marks contained in his wages when he had worked 6 hours for him. After 6 hours' labor, they are both quits. Neither owes the other a pfenning. Who the fuck named this British-ass currency? Pfenning? Hold on there, the capitalist now cries. I have hired the worker for a whole day, for 12 hours. 6 hours, however, are only half a day. So go right on to working until the 6 hours are up, and only then shall we be quits. End quote. And in fact, the worker has to comply with this contract he voluntarily, quote-unquote, entered into, according to which he has pledged himself to work 12 hours for a labor product which can cost 6 hours of labor. It is just the same with piece wages. So again, piece wages are like door dashing, you get paid per delivery, not like a set wage. Per item produced is more accurate. Let us assume that our worker per commodity produced. Let us assume that our worker makes 12 items of a commodity in 12 hours. Each of these costs 2 marks in raw materials and depreciation and is sold at 2.5 marks. When the capitalist, on the same assumptions as before, will give the worker 25 pfennings per items, that makes 3 marks for 12 items, to earn which the worker needs 12 hours. The capitalist receives 30 marks for 12 items, deducts 24 marks for raw materials, and depreciation there remains 6 marks, of which he pays 3 marks to the worker in wages and pockets 3 marks. It is just as above. Here too the worker works 6 hours for himself, that is, for the replacement of his wages, half an hour in each of 12 hours, and 6 hours for the capitalist. Right, so even if you're producing commodities piece by piece, it's still almost exact same as getting paid, hourly per wages. You're exploited at the exact same rate. And in fact, they can usually exploit you better because they can claim that your quality of work isn't as good, so I'm not going to pay you for this item or that item. They can get away with things like that. Like this delivery isn't as good, the customer demanded a refund, fuck you, DoorDash will do that to you. The difficulty over which the best economists came to grief so long as they started out from the value of quote-unquote labor vanishes as soon as we start from the value of quote-unquote labor power instead. In our present-day capitalist society, labor power is a commodity like any other, and yet quite a peculiar commodity. It has, namely, the peculiar property of being a value-creating power and a source of value, and indeed, with suitable treatment, a source of more value than it itself possesses. With the present day of production, human labor power not only produces in one day a greater value than it itself possesses and costs. With every new scientific discovery, with every new technical invention, this surplus of its daily product over its daily cost increases, and therefore that portion of the labor day in which the worker works to produce the replacement of his day's wages decreases. Consequently, on the other hand, the portion of the labor day in which he has to make a present of his labor to the capitalist without being paid for it increases. And this is the economic constitution of the whole of our present-day society. It is the working class alone which produces all values. That's actually a controversial statement. Marx would disagree with that, I feel like. And he does in the Gotha Critique. Marx says that labor is not the source of all values. So I don't know why Engels would say that. But Marx said that there's many values under capitalism, use values under capitalism, nature, sunshine, the earth, it produces naturally values. But so if you know in the comment section why Engels said that the working class alone produces all values, please let me know. For value is only another expression for labor, that expression whereby in our present day's capitalist society is designated the amount of socially necessary labor contained within the particular commodity. These values produced by workers do not, however, belong to the workers. They belong to the owners of raw materials, machines, tools, and to the reserve funds which allow these owners to buy the labor power of the working class. From the whole mass of products produced by it, the working class therefore receives back only a part for itself. Yeah, I mean, it's overall a pretty simple idea, right? Really it is. Surplus of value. Everything that he's explaining, this surplus of value that he's explaining, is a really simple idea. Everybody fundamentally understands it. That saying, boss makes a dollar, I make a dime. That's why I poop on company time. I mean, that's essentially what he's saying. But you do need to understand the underlying mechanisms of it. But really, most people, fundamentally on some basal level, understand that they produce more value than they actually get, and that their boss gets most of their value. And as we have just seen, the other part, which the capitalist class keeps for itself and at most has to divide with the class of landowners, becomes larger with every new discovery and invention, while the part falling to the share of the working class reckoned per head either increases only very slowly and inconsiderably, or not at all, and under certain circumstances may even fall. But these discoveries and inventions, which supersede each other at an ever-increasing rate, this productivity of human labor, which rises day by day to an extent previously unheard of, finally give rise to a conflict in which present-day capitalist economy must perish. On the one hand are immeasurable riches and superfluity of products which the purchasers cannot cope with. On the other hand, the great mass of society, proletarianized, turned into wage workers, and precisely for this reason made incapable of appropriating for themselves this superfluity of products. The division of society into a small, excessively rich class and a large, propertyless class of wage workers results in a society suffocating from its own superfluity, while the great majority of its members is scarcely, or even not at all, protected from extreme want. This state of affairs becomes daily more absurd and more unnecessary. It must be abolished. It can be abolished. A new social order is possible in which the present-day class differences will have disappeared, and in which perhaps after a short transitional period involving some privation, but at any rate great value morally, through the planned utilization and extension of the already existing enormous productive forces of all members of society, and with uniform obligation to the work, the means for existence, for enjoying life, and for the development and employment of full bodily, mental faculties will be available in an equal measure and in an ever-increasing fullness. And that the new workers are becoming more and more determined to win this new social order will be demonstrated on both sides of the ocean by May the 1st tomorrow and by Sunday, May 3rd. Frederick Engels, London, April 30th, 1891. All right, on to the Synopsis of Capital.
Synopsis of Capital. There's many summaries of Marx's Capital, and I'm not fucking reading Marx's Capital for you guys. But I will read a summary of Capital, and there's many out there. But who better to get a summary of Capital from none other than his co-conspirator in the ideology of communism, Frederick Engels. Stop typing that communism is not an ideology. I can already hear you. All right. Section 1. the labor process and the process of producing surplus value. The purchaser of labor power consumes it by setting its seller to work. So what Engels here is talking about by the purchaser of labor power is the capitalist. Under capitalism, your labor power is a commodity. You sell it to the capitalist, and the capitalist gives it back to you in the form of a wage. Well, he doesn't give it all to you. He takes some of it for himself. And so that's what Engels is talking about. He's the purchaser of the labor power is the capitalist, and the seller setting him to work, that's the worker. This labor to produce commodities at first turns out use values. And in this property, it is independent of the specific relation between capitalist and laborer. Description of the labor process as such. The labor process on a capitalist basis has two peculiarities. The laborer works under the capitalist's control. The product is the capitalist's property, since the labor process is not only a process between two things, purchased by the capitalist, labor power and means of production. Okay, so a capitalist buys both the means of production and labor power. The laborer works under the capitalist, and the capitalist owns what the worker produces. So you don't own what you're producing. This is basically the basis of Marx's conception of alienation, right? You clock into work every day, and you make some other jagoff rich all day, and you don't work for yourself. Doesn't that piss you off? Does that make you feel alienated from society? It makes me feel alienated from society. Well, if I worked in those fields. But when I did, it did. But now I'm unemployed. But the capitalist does not want the use value produced for its own sake, but only as a depository of exchange value, and especially of surplus value. Labor under this condition, where the commodity was a unity of use value and exchange value, becomes a unity of the production process and of the process of creating value. Right. So there's a lot of concepts here. Exchange value. A commodity has two values. Use value, that's the thing it's used for. Exchange value, that's how much moolah money you can make off of it. And then he's also saying that labor itself, under capitalism, becomes sort of an expression of the relation of capitalism itself. And this is a very exploitative relationship. Thus, the quantity of labor embodied in a product is to be investigated. Finally, he's talking about surplus value and labor power. So under capitalism, the main source of value for most commodities is labor, socially necessary labor time. So, and that is created through labor power. So it's the average amount of time across an entire industry that it takes somebody to make a product. If you take longer than that average and you make like an especially luxury product, it's going to be more expensive. If you take longer across the entire industry to make a shitty product, it's going to be, less expensive. And then surplus value, that's just the moolah that they get from you, right? Anything you're not paying the wage that you produce within a workday. Yarn, for example, let 10 pounds of cotton be necessary for making it, say 10 shillings, and instruments of labor, whose wear and tear are inevitable in spinning. Here denoted in brief as spindle share. Say 2 shillings. Thus there are 12 shillings worth of means of production in a product. I.e., insomuch, 1, the product has become an actual use value, in this case yarn, and 2, only the socially necessary labor time was represented in these instruments of labor. How much is added to it by the labor of spinning? Right? So right now he's asking okay, so there's 12 shillings worth within the cotton. There's some value from the actual use value of the yarn. Okay, so yarn has a use value that adds value. You use yarn for knitting. Old ladies use it for crocheting. And then there's a socially necessary labor time that was represented in the instruments. So the instruments themselves. So that's the means of production, right? So the machines that are used to turn this wool into yarn. There's some value within them too. But Engels is saying, well, how much value comes from human labor? How much value comes from human labor, not the machine or the yarn itself, right? The labor process is here viewed from an altogether different angle. In the value of the product, the labors of the cotton planter, of the spindle maker, etc., and of the spinner are commensurable, qualitatively equal parts of general, human, necessary value-creating labor, and therefore distinguishable only qualitatively, and for that very reason, quantitatively comparable by the length of time, presupposing that it is socially necessary labor time, for only the latter is value-creating. Assume that the value of a day's labor power is 3 shillings, and it is represented in 6 hours of labor. That of 1 2/3 pounds of yarn are made per hour. Hence, in 6 hours, 10 pounds of yarn from 10 pounds of cotton, as above. Then 3 shillings of value have been added in 6 hours, and the value of the product is 15 shillings. 10 plus 2 plus 3 shillings, or 1 shilling and a half a pound of yarn. I have no idea who the fuck named this British ass money shilling. What dumbass decided to name it shilling? What the fuck is a shilling? Goddamn British people. I fucking hate them so much. Basically, in this equation, he's just trying to find the source of value, and basically that value is human labor power. That's the one that's adding the most value to the product. It's increasing its value. And there's also value within the use of yarn, and there's also value within nature. So nature provides its own value, use value, but the big proponent is human labor, not machine, human labor. But in this case, there is no surplus value that is of no use to the capitalist. We assume that the value of a day's labor power was 3 shillings because half a working day, or 6 hours, is incorporated in it. But the fact that only half a working day is required to maintain the worker for 24 hours does not in any way prevent him from working a whole day. The value of labor power and the value it creates are 2 different quantities. Its useful property was only conditional sine qua non, but what was decisive was the specific use value of labor power in being the source of more exchange value than it has itself. Right, so there's a lot within that sentence, right? But here's what you basically need to understand. Engels is saying the main source of value within commodity is labor power, right? And you go to work and you produce, let's say, like fucking $10,000 worth of value. You know, you're a really hard worker and you're super good at just producing commodity after commodity after commodity. Like you're fucking crazy. You're a machine, right? And you go down to the boss and he hands you your check. You produced $10,000 fucking dollars in that day, and you only get a check for $1,000, right? So a certain section of your day was spent making your wage, that $1,000 that you got paid, okay? And that is called necessary labor, right? And the rest of your day is spent making the money for your jad-off motherfucking boss. And that's called surplus value. And that's what that motherfucker takes. Half of your workday isn't even spent making your own fucking wage. It's spent making Jeff Bezos's. Fucking hell, capitalism pisses me off. But that's what he's basically saying. Half of your workday, it doesn't have to be like a clean half, right? But for simplicity of mathematics, say, half of your workday you make your wage, whatever you're going to get paid in value. The rest of the day you make your worker's wage. I mean, your boss's wage, your CEO's wage. You know, like that's basically what he's saying. Hence, the laborer works 12 hours, spins 20 pounds of cotton, worth 20 shillings and 4 shillings worth of spindles, and his labor costs 3 shillings total, 27 shillings. But in the product, there are embodied 4 days' labor in the shape of spindles and cotton, and 1 day's labor of the spinner. In all 5 days, at 6 shillings total, 30 shillings. Value of product. We have a surplus value of 3 shillings. Money has been converted into capital. All the conditions of the problem are fulfilled. As a value-creating process, the labor process becomes a process of producing surplus value. That's money that's not going into your motherfucking pocket. That's good money going into Jeff Bezos' motherfucking pocket. God damn it. Jeff Bezos, if you're listening to this, I'm coming for you, motherfucker. I'm actually not. Don't. CIA, please don't. Please. I might cut that out. As a value-creating process, the labor process becomes a process for producing surplus value the moment it is prolonged beyond the point where it delivers a simple equivalent for the paid for value of labor power. So what he's saying there is your day's work becomes surplus value the second you stop working. The second you get past the point where you're producing value for your wage. Okay, so the exact hour, the exact minute you're making value at your work, the exact minute you get past making enough value for your wage, that's when it becomes surplus value. It all goes to the boss. Jeff Bezos, if you hear this, I'm coming for you. I'm coming for you, motherfucker. I hope you hear this. In Minecraft, the value creating process differs from the simple labor process in that the latter is considered qualitatively and only to the extent that it comprises socially necessary labor time. As the unity of the labor process and the value creating process, the production process is the production of commodities. As the unity of the labor process and the process of producing surplus value, it is the process of the capitalist production of commodities. Reduction of compound labor to simple labor. Engels is basically talking about here is that compound labor, which is, like what we typically refer to as skilled labor, and simple labor, which is like typically what we refer to colloquially as unskilled labor. They're both treated on the market as the same thing. Even though compound labor, like a doctor who, in order to get his socially necessary labor time and also, labor power, somebody has to go through like 8 years of schooling. So that really ups the cost of it, and the investment within it. So that makes them create more value. Even though that compound labor, i.e. skilled labor, creates more value on the market, basically, they're basically treated as the same thing within the free market. And essentially, skilled labor is just a multiple of unskilled labor, right? So it's just treated as a multiple of unskilled labor on the market. And then finally, I don't know why Engels didn't define what a commodity was, but a commodity is something that is created to serve a human need and made for exchange. So, if you made a birthday cake for your friend and you gave it to your friend for free, that's not a commodity. But if you made a birthday cake to sell on the street and you sold people like slices of birthday cake or the full birthday cake, then that is a commodity. It's something that's made to serve a human need, or a service made to serve a human need. It can be that too. And it's exchanged, basically. So it's something that's created for exchange and not purely use, right? So every commodity has two values within it. It's exchange value, which is how much moolah you can make off it, and use value. And why is that important? Because us workers, we're interested in the use value of things. For us, who gives a fuck what the exchange value is? I'm a working class man, right? A house is for living in, right? A shovel is for digging. For a food is for eating, right? That's the use value. For a capitalist, for the capitalist class, all that matters is exchange value. How much moolah can I make off of this fucking house? How much moolah can I make off of this fucking shovel? How much moolah can I make off of this fucking food? And because exchange value is decaying under capitalism, houses sit empty. That could perfectly good houses that could be used. Shovels sit just collecting dust. I mean, it's not like we have a big shovel shortage within American society. But food goes into the trash rather than filling hungry bellies. They would much rather destroy that commodity than give it away for its use, which is eating. So, yeah. I'm going to report the next section on another day. So, Section 2, Constant and Variable Capital. All right, so constant and variable capital. Remember, we've learned about what capital is. It's MCM. It's money that a capitalist uses to buy a commodity, usually somebody's labor power, in addition to usually like raw resources, something like that. These commodities are then turned into something of more value, right? Be through the labor process itself. And then they sell it for more money. And so that's MCM, right? Money, commodity, more money. There's two kinds of capital, however. And capital, remember again, it's not just money sitting in a bank. It's a tool of leverage within capitalism. It is a social relation between capitalists, the haves and the have-nots, the workers who sell their labor power in the form of wages to capitalists, right? And it is fundamentally means that workers are expropriated of their surplus value, right? So it represents dead labor of other human beings transformed into this method of control, right? Okay. So there's two kinds of capital. There's constant capital and variable capital. Constant capital is capital that is invested into means of production, right? So that is past people's labor is transformed into this thing called capital, right? You worked for your boss. You produced, let's say, $500 worth of value that day. Your boss took that, paid you $50. He took that $450. He turned that $450 into constant capital. So he bought a new desk for the office, right? Or maybe a new machine for the office, right? Like a printer or something. Or even all the employees in the office, right? All your coworkers, he used that to buy a new office building, or a new machine, right? That quickens the workload. So that's constant capital. Variable capital is capital spent on hiring out human labor, workers, right? So workers, living labor, human labor. So that's money spent on paying people wages, basically, right? And labor power under capitalism is a commodity. Remember, labor is somebody's actual work. Labor power is somebody's ability to do work, okay? And that's what you negotiate with a capitalist for your wage for. Okay, my ability to do this much work, you'll pay me for this much, right? And then that's what you get back in the form of your wage. You sell your labor power, your ability to work. Labor power is the only thing under capitalism that truly is the main source of value, right? There's plenty of other sources of value, such as raw materials given by nature. But the main source of value is labor power. You work with your own two hands and you create something of more value out of raw products, okay? And so constant capital, it cannot create value, right? So machines cannot create value. Only human labor power can. Machines under capitalism act as stores of value. They're like banks. All right? And these banks, they impart a little bit of value onto a commodity, but they represent past people's labor, okay? So that it's almost like you're a soul, right? So the boss took $450 from you and he turned that into a printer. And every time that printer prints a piece of paper, imparts your past labor that he used to buy that printer onto that piece of paper, right? So in that sense, it's not creating any value. It's just taking your past value that you created with your own two hands and it's imparting it onto the commodity, all right? So let's begin. The labor process adds new value to the object of labor, but at the same time, it transfers the value of the object of labor to the product, thus preserving it by merely adding new value. This double result is attained in this manner. The specifically useful quality, character of labor converts one use value into another use value, and thus preserves value. The value-creating, abstractly general quantitative character of labor, however, adds value, right? So that right there, Marx just described the process that I was talking about, right? Only human labor power creates value. Well, is the main source of value. It's not the only source. Marx would get pissed off if he said it's the only source. He wrote that and got the critique. Don't say the labor is the only source of value. But it's the main source. And your living labor gets turned into dead labor through the form of buying industrial machines, right? And these industrial machines don't actually create any value. E.g., let the productivity of a spinning labor multiply sixfold. As useful qualitative labor, it preserves in the same time 6 times as many instruments of labor, but it adds only the new value as before, i.e. each pound of yarn, and there is only 1/6 of the new value previously added. As value-creating labor, it accomplishes no more than before. The contrary is true. If the productivity of spinning labor remains the same, but the value of the instruments of labor rises. The instruments of labor transfer to the product only the value which they lose themselves, right? So why are these industrial machines transferring value onto the product? It's because they have a lifespan. Every time they create a new commodity, right? Every time that printer prints a new piece of paper, it is taking off of its lifespan a little bit and a little bit. And those cents that were used, the money that was used, the $450 that was used to buy that printer, every time it prints a new commodity, it shortens its lifespan, and a cent from that $450 goes onto that commodity. And that adds to the commodity's value, yes, but it's not creating new value, okay? This is the case in differing degree. Coal, lubricants, etc. are consumed completely. Raw materials take on new form. Instruments, machinery, etc. transmit value only slowly and by parts, and the wear and tear are calculated by experience. But the instrument remains continually as a whole in the labor process. Therefore, the same instrument counts as a whole in the labor process, but only partially in the process of producing surplus value, so that the difference between the two processes is reflected here in material factors. Conversely, the raw material, which forms waste, enters wholly into the process of producing surplus value, and only partly in the labor process, since it appears in the product minus the waste. But in no case can an instrument of labor transfer more exchange value than it possessed itself, right? So there Marx is saying, it's like a bank. It's like a bank. It doesn't create any value. It's just storing value and imparting it onto the commodity. In the labor process, it acts only as use value, and hence can give only the exchange value that it possessed previously. This preserving of value is very advantageous to the capitalist, but costs him nothing. Yet the preserved value only reappears when it already was present, and only the labor process adds a new value. That is, in the capitalist production, surplus value, the excess of the product's value over the value of the consumed elements of the product, means of production and labor power. Here within, we have been described the forms of existence which the original capital value takes on in dropping its money form and being converted into factors of the labor process. 1, in the purchase of instruments of labor. 2, in the purchase of labor power, right? So this is what capital can become. Capital can become variable capital, which is buying human labors, or constant capital, which is buying machines. The capital invested in instruments of labor does not, therefore, alter the magnitude of its value in the production process. We call it constant capital. The portion invested in labor power does change its value it produces, its own value and surplus value. Therefore, it is called variable capital. Capital is constant only in relation to the production process, which is specifically given, in which it does not change. It can consist sometimes of more, sometimes of fewer instruments of labor, and the purchased instruments of labor may rise or fall in value, but that does not affect their relationship to the production process. Likewise, the percentage in which a given capital is subdivided into constant and variable capital may change, but in any given case, the C remains constant and the V variable. All right, so he's just talking about the formula between constant capital and variable capital. And they're always in a fight with each other, right? Living labor is always in a fight with constant capital. And capitalism, slowly over time, takes human living labor and it transfers it into these machines because these machines can up productivity. And even though producing a commodity faster may drop its value, right, because it's dependent on socially necessary labor time, by dropping its value, because capitalism is a market, the capitalists can offset that drop in value by selling a lot more of these commodities because people generally want cheaper items, right? Section 4, the working day. The necessary labor time is given. The surplus labor is variable, but within certain limits. It can never be reduced to nil since the capitalist production ceases. All right, so what Engels here is talking about is how within everybody's workday, right, there are two parts of it. There's a part of your workday where you produce the value that you're going to see back in your paycheck, right? So you work in a day, you produce $500 worth of value, and you're going to see $50 back in your paycheck. So you're getting ripped off by a lot, right? So the first, let's say 1 hour of your workday, you spend making back your wage, right? So you made that $50 that you're going to see in that paycheck. This is called necessary labor, okay? Then the other part of your workday, you spend making your boss's wages, the wages that your boss is going to take from you, the value that your boss is going to take from you for his own profits, for his own capital. And that is called surplus labor, right? So there's a lot of tricky ways in which capitalists can minimize the amount of time that you are doing your necessary labor and you are doing more surplus labor. That is, there's a lot of ways that capitalists can take more surplus value out of you and give you less in your wages. And one of those ways, and this is the sneakiest, is to lengthen the workday. Capitalism is inherently incentivized. If it was not for the labor movement, capitalists would naturally have us be all working still, like in the Victorian England days, 12 hours, right? 12 hours, 16 hours. People were working insane hours within the factories. And by extending the length of the day, there's less time within your day in which you're making your necessary labor, right? The wages that you're going to see back, and more time in which you're making wages for the capitalists in terms of value that you're producing. It can never go as high as 24 hours for physical reasons. So Engels is saying you can't make somebody work for 24 hours because people need sleep. And moreover, the maximum limit is always affected by moral grounds as well. But these limits are very elastic. The economic demand is that by the working day should be no longer than the normal wear and tear of the worker. But what is normal? An antimony results and only force can decide. Hence, the struggle between the working class and the capitalist class for the normal working day. Right, so this is one of the biggest cruxes of the capitalist, bourgeois, proletariat struggle. This is one of the many, right, factors of it. Working. Capitalists overwork us so much because they want to make us do more surplus labor, less necessary labor. And so people are working way past their own reproduction, their own subsistence, their own wages, and spending a good amount of their days making moolah for their bosses. And so that is a very big crux of the labor movement. It always has been, the fight over the workday. Surplus labor in previous social epochs. As long as the exchange value is not more important than the use value, surplus labor is milder. Among the ancients, only where direct exchange value, gold and silver, was produced, surplus labor was terrible. Likewise in the slave states of America until mass production of cotton for export. Likewise corvée labor in Romania. Corvée labor is the best means of comparison with capitalist exploitation, because the former fixes and shows surplus labor as specific labor time to be performed. The Reglement Organique of Wallachia. So what is he saying? What is he talking about Romania? Well, basically what Engels. Basically what Engels is saying is capitalism as a system is incentivized to make people work as long as possible. And this is very unique to capitalism, right? All throughout human history, in previous modes of production, right? Feudalism, a slave society, the elites took surplus value, right? Or surplus labor from their underlings, right? The lower classes, such as noblemen to feudal serfs. But usually it was not that much work. Like within Capital, I believe Marx said that the Romanian peasants only worked about 50 days of the year for their lords, right? The rest of the days of the year, they worked for themselves, right? So those 50 days were the harvest season, planting season of crops. And in that sense, capitalism is incentivized to make you work 24/7, 5 days a week. In fact, if it really wanted to, and it really does want to, without the labor movement, it would make you work 7 days a week. It is naturally inclined to do that. 7 days a week, 18 hours, 16 hours, those insane hours that factory workers would work in England. So that's what he's basically saying. Like capitalism is unique in that it makes you overwork. And it is true. I mean, capitalism is one of the only systems, I think, in human history where we have invented terms like burnout. I mean, not that, being a slave or a feudal serf was easy anyways, it's not, nobody's saying that we should go back to those modes of production either. The English Factory Acts are negative expression of the greed for surplus labor, just as the foregoing was its positive expression. The Factory Acts, that of 1850, 10.5 hours and 7.5 hours on Saturdays, equals 60 hours per week. Mill owners profit through evasion. Exploitation in unrestricted or only later restricted branches. Lace industry, potteries, lucifer matches, wallpaper, baking, railway employees, seamstresses, blacksmiths, day and night workers in shifts, metallurgy, and metal industry. These facts prove that capital regards the labor as nothing else than labor power, all of whose late time is labor power, as far as this is at all possible at a given moment, and that the length of life of labor power is immaterial to the capitalist. So what Engels is basically saying here is, well, England had a chance to limit the working day and actually give the working class some concessions, right? But it left out all these industries from that time limit, right, that was set on the working day. And this proves that under capitalism, workers are not seen as human beings. They're seen as nothing but labor power. And labor power under capitalism is a commodity. It's a commodity that creates more value for capitalists, right, through the production process. And so, within that sense, since it is just a commodity, they don't see you as human beings. They just see you as machines that make more value for a product. And they are incentivized to make it work as long as possible. That's basically the 2 points he's trying to get across. There's no humanity in capitalism. It only sees its workers as machines that produce more value. And that, secondly, that, lengthening the workday creates more surplus value for capitalists. And it's incentivized to do that. But is this not against the interests of the capitalists? What about the replacement of what is rapidly worn out? The organized slave trade in the interior of the United States has raised the rapid wearing out of slaves to an economic principle, exactly like the supply of laborers from rural districts in Europe. Poor house supply, labor power provided by poorhouses. The capitalist sees only the continuously available surplus population and wears it out. Whether the race perishes, apris mo la doge, capital is reckless of the health or the length of life of the laborer, unless under compulsion from society. And free competition brings out the inherent laws of capitalist production in the shape of external coercive laws having power over every individual capitalist. Right, so what he's saying a lot there, and one of the things that you have to understand, and Engels is not going that deep into it, he might go deeper into it later on, is that you have this fight between constant capital and variable capital, right? Capitalists spend more money on the machines than the workers, right? So suddenly, when you get these new machines that create, like bombastic changes in industries, like let's say AI, and these machines lead to the displacement of tons of workers, right? Capital spends suddenly all its money on the constant capital and no money on variable capital, right? So no money on hiring out workers, right? All the money that was going to hiring out workers is going towards the new AI. Suddenly, the market floods with people who are unemployed. And very often capitalists will say, well, the market readjusts itself to find new jobs. Yes, but it's never fast enough. It's very anachronistic. And so this always leads to a constant supply of unemployed people within capitalism. That's called the reserve army of labor. And what Engels is saying here is that the reserve army of labor is a very great tool for capitalists because you always have this desperate portion of the population that is just begging for food within their mouths, right? These are unemployed people, can't find a job, begging for food within their mouths, who are willing to take work at any rate. And also it leads to surplus populations, right? So populations are regarded as worthless under capitalism, right? And whole sections of humanity are labeled that. And of course, we can't ignore that often happens under racial lines, right? Racial, sexual, gender lines. Establishment of a normal working day, the result of centuries of struggle between capitalists and labor. At the beginning, laws were made to raise working time, not lower it. The first statute of laborers, 23rd Edward III, was passed under the pretext that the plague had so decimated the population that everyone had to do more work. Hence, maximum wages and a limit of the working day were fixed by law. Damn, maximum wages. They didn't even have minimum wages back then, but they had maximum wages? Damn. Shit, that would have sucked. In 1496, under Henry VII, the working day of field laborers and all artificers continued from 5 a.m. to between 7 and 8 p.m. in summer, March to September, with 1 hour, 1.5 hour, and 0.5 hour in all 3 hours break. In winter, it was from 5 a.m. to dark. This statute was never strictly enforced. In the 18th century, the whole week's labor was not yet available to capital, with the exception of agricultural labor. Controversies of that time. Only with a modern, large-scale industry was this and more achieved. It broke down all bounds and exploited workers the most shamelessly. The proletariat resisted as soon as it recollected itself. The 5 acts from 1802 to 1833 were only nominal since there were no inspectors. Only the Act of 1883 created a normal working day in the 4 textile industries from 5:30 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. Fucking hell! In 1883, you had to work from 5:30 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. in England? Fucking hell, what the fuck? God damn. No wonder British people are miserable. During which time young persons from 13 to 18 years of age could be employed only 12 hours, with 1.5-hour pauses. Children from 9 to 13 years of age, only 8 hours, while night work of children and juveniles was prohibited. The relay system and its abuse for purposes of evasion. Finally, the Act of 1844, which put women of all ages on the same basis as juveniles. Children limited to 6.5 hours, the relay system curbed. On the other hand, children permitted from 8 years on. Oh, goddamn, 8-year-old kids were working for 6.5 hours. I mean, that's bad, but it's not as bad as I thought that would be. At last, in 1847, the 10 hours bill forced through for women and juveniles. The capitalist efforts against it. A flaw in the Act of 1847 leads to the Compromise Act of 1850, which fixes the working day for juveniles and women. 5 days a week, 10.5 hours. Damn, 10.5 hours, there it is. 1 day of 7.5 hours, 60 hours a week. And between that, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. work days. Otherwise, the Act of 1847 was enforced for children. The exception for the silk industry. In 1853, the working time for children was also limited to between 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Fuck! Never mind, goddamn, child labor is not cool after all. I thought it was. We at the Pokepreet podcast support child labor. Printworks Act in 1845 limits almost nothing. Children and women can work 16 hours. Bleaching and dyeing works, 1860. Lace factories, 1861. Potteries and many other branches, 1863. All had to work 16 hours. Damn. Large-scale industry thus at first creates the need for limiting working time, but it later found that the same overwork has gradually taken possession of all other branches of industry as well. History further shows that the isolated free laborer is defenseless against the capitalists and succumbs especially with the introduction of women's and children's labor, so that it is here that the class struggle develops between the worker and the capitalists. Right, so basically what he's saying is that by incorporating women and children into the workforce, capitalists were able to pay them a lot less, drive down wages. Engels is not saying that woman working is bad necessarily. He's just saying that this is just how capitalism worked because of patriarchy and other things like that. Women were just paid a lot less. And then also capitalism is very incentivized to extend the working day. So that's what he's basically saying. In France, the 12-hour day law for all ages and branches of work passed only in 1846. Complete freedom of labor in Belgium. The 8-hour movement in America. Thus, the laborer comes out of the production process quite different than he entered. The labor contract was not the act of a free agent. The time for which he is free to sell his labor power is the only time for which he is forced to sell it. And the only mass opposition of the workers wins for them the passing of a law that shall prevent the workers from selling, by voluntary contract with labor, themselves and their generation into slavery and death. In place of the pompous catalog of the inalienable rights of man comes the modest Magna Carta of the Factory Acts. Right, so basically he's saying, these are just some reforms that workers have won, but they're kind of bullshit. They're not enough, obviously. And in addition to that, he's talking about how very oftentimes we're told about the free laborer, right? The free laborer under the market, but it's not a very free process itself. Ben Shapiro all the time, he'll say this libertarian bullshit, like you signed a contract under capitalism to work this much. Look, it's a coercive act in and of itself, the way that the capitalist process is laid out in which you sell yourself onto the market in the return of wages, right? It's an exploitative process itself. 5. The rate and mass of surplus value. Understanding the last sections, this section is pretty easy to grasp. With the rate, the mass is also given. If the daily value of one labor power is 3 shillings and the rate of surplus value is 100%, its daily mass equals 3 shillings for one laborer. 1. Since the variable capital is the money expression of the value of all the labor power simultaneously employed by one capitalist, the mass of the surplus value produced by them is equal to the variable capital multiplied by the rate of surplus value. Both factors can vary, different combinations thus arising. The mass of surplus value can grow even with decreasing variable capital if the rate rises, that is, if the working day is lengthened. 2. This increase in the rate of surplus value has its absolute limit in that the working day can never be prolonged to the full 24 hours. Hence, the total value of one worker's daily production can never equal the value of 24 working hours. Thus, in order to obtain the same mass of surplus value, variable capital can be replaced by increasing exploitation of the laborer only within these limits. This is important for the explanation of various phenomena arising from the contradictory tendency of capital. So basically what he's saying is, a human being can only work for 24 hours. So how do you get more surplus value out of somebody within the couple hours that you are working them, right? Compared to their necessary labor time, which is the wages that they're getting, right? So how do you get more of that out of them? You work them with more intensity with the time that you have, the limited time that you have. Anyways, 1, to reduce the variable capital in the number of workers employed, and 2, to produce the greatest possible mass of surplus value nonetheless. So capitalism has 2 issues here, right? Its goal is to actually reduce the variable capital or the number of workers employed, the capital that's spent on hiring out human labor. But 2, its goal is to produce the most amount of surplus value possible, right? Which you can only get by hiring out human labor. So how does it solve this? What essentially ends up happening is that by employing these machines, labor power is shortened, yes. The amount of socially necessary labor time is shortened, yes, to produce a commodity. But since these commodities are being produced at such a rapid rate, any value that's offset by their lowering in value can be sold much more rapidly on the market, right? Because people like cheaper goods. And so that's one way in which this can be offset. However, there is a problem. Again, remember, variable capital creates value because human labor power creates value. Constant capital, or the machines of production, can only transfer their value, right, onto a commodity. They don't actually create any value. And when these new machines, these new productive machines, get adopted across the entire industry, they cause a falling rate of profit across the entire industry. If a capitalist has a new machine that makes burgers in 30 seconds compared to 1 minute, right? That's great for him, right? He's suddenly able to sell burgers at a much lower cost. So even though, the value is less, he's selling so many because people like cheaper burgers that he's offsetting his loss in profit. But what happens when, let's say this was in Burger King, when Wendy's and McDonald's and Sonic and all the other burger shops suddenly implement in this machine? Now it's industry-wide. Everybody's selling the burgers at the same value, right? And so this creates a falling rate of profit. Human labor has been replaced by this machine. Human labor is the main source of value. It's been offset, and because of the competition of the market, they were forced to replace it. And so the rate of profit falls across the entire industry. And this is a ticking time bomb within capitalism. Capitalism is geared towards automating as many processes as it can. Will it ever reach full automation? Nobody knows. But every time it does, it furthers its own grave in terms of creating more reserve army of labor, right? Unemployed people who are thrown off the market, and also its own profitability. 3. The masses of value and surplus value produced by different capitals for the given value and equally high degree of exploitation of labor power are related directly as the magnitudes of the variable components of these capital. This seems to contradict all facts. For a given society and a given workday, surplus value can be increased only by increasing the number of workers, i.e. the population, with a given number of workers, only by lengthening the working day. This is important, however, only for absolute surplus value. So he's going to get into the different kinds of surplus value. It now turns out that not every sum of money can be transformed into capital, that a minimum exists, the cost of price of a single labor power and of a necessary instruments of labor. In other words, to be able to live like a worker, the capitalist would have to have 2 workers with a rate of surplus value of 50%, and yet save nothing. Even with 8, he is still a master. Hence, in the Middle Ages, people were forcibly hampered in transformation from craftsmen into capitalists by limitation of the number of journeymen to be employed by one master. The minimum of wealth required to form a real capitalist varies in the different periods and branches of business. So once again, he's reiterating that one of the ways to increase your surplus value that you can extract from workers is by increasing the working day. He also mentions that capital is a relation of production and that capitalism has led to the most exploitation compared to previous modes of production. Has led to a higher rate of exploitation by centralizing this process, right? In order for these guild masters to become capitalists, they had to get more and more people under their sort of wing of capital, right? So it's a very unique process in that sense. So now he's going to move on to relative surplus value, right? So we understand absolute surplus value. You work for 8 hours in the day, you produce $500 worth of value. You only made about $50 in your paycheck. The $450 goes to your boss. That's absolute surplus value, right? And that works. And in order to increase the surplus value that goes to the capitalist and exploit you, he can lend them the working day. However, there's also relative surplus value. And what relative surplus value does is it reduces your necessary labor time, right? The amount of time that you spend working in your day that actually goes towards your paycheck. And how does it do that? It increases the productivity of your work. It introduces new technologies, newfangled machines that produce the commodities at a faster rate, right? Like that burger machine that took the burger from 1 minute to 30 seconds. Suddenly you're making burgers so much faster that the value that you're creating is a lot less. And necessarily, because there's less socially necessary labor time to create the burger, right? 1 minute versus 30 seconds. And so by doing that, they're able to give you a lot less of a wage and a lot more of it goes towards the capitalist, right? So you can see how this is a machine in which there's a tug and a pull on every single section of it, right? More investment into constant capital or machines creates a reserve army of labor, right? Unemployed people. More investment into productivity leads to a lowering of the value of the worker, right? The lowering of the necessary labor or, the amount of wages that they're going to get. And so there's a push and a pull in every section of capitalism as a machine. It's full of contradictions. And that's one of the historically, in fact, somewhat historically progressive things about capitalism in that capital has always existed. Class society has always existed. In some form or another, right? Early capital was more like constant capital. Marx identified constant capital within the guilds within the feudal age, right? They had these constant capitals within their, workshops and things like that. However, capitalism has taken all these economic trends, right? Money, class society, simplified them. Class society, there's only bourgeois and proletariat, and it's taken all these functions of class society, human society, and simplified them and produced them to an unending, never before seen scale. And so it allows for the transformation into the opposite, which is socialism, so much easier, a classless, moneyless society. Anyways, so relative surplus value, it's basically where they make your own wages, though the value that you produce, worth less by making you more productive, right? By making you able to produce commodities faster, it actually decreases the worth of your work, right? Because it's less than socially necessary labor time, right? So think about it like this. A shoemaker who makes the shoe from scratch, every step of the process, right? He creates the sole, he hand stitches the laces, right? He hand stitches every single piece of leather onto that shoe. He's able to charge a lot more for that shoe. A worker in a factory who just puts the shoelaces in and then a machine comes in and it just stitches everything together and puts all the parts away. He can only command like $5 an hour, right? And I know that's an extreme example, right? That the master shoemaker is making $1,000. He can only command $5 an hour. But that it does show you how relative surplus value works, right? By making the worker more productive, their able to charge less. And that is also another function of capitalism. Also, it de-skills the worker, right? It takes these craftsmen who are able to make the shoe from the entire process and just puts them onto an assembly line, each just contributing one part of it, right? Somebody puts in the shoelace, somebody puts in the sole, yada, yada. So, there's a great de-skilling that happens within capitalism and the capitalist process. All right. 1. The concept of relative surplus value. For a given working day, surplus value can be increased by reducing the necessary labor. This can in turn be obtained, apart from lowering wages below value, only by reducing the value of labor. That is, by reducing the price of the necessary means of subsistence. This in turn is to be attained only by increasing the productive power of labor, by revolutionizing the mode of production itself. The surplus value produced by lengthening the working day is absolute. That produced by shortening the necessary labor time is relative surplus value, right? So relative surplus value is reducing the amount of necessary labor within your day, right? The labor that you do that you're going to see back in your paycheck versus the labor that you do that goes into your boss's paycheck, right? But remember, in every single work day, it's divided into two. And necessary labor is the labor that you do for yourself. And then the rest of your work day, you're working for your boss's wages, which is BS. In order to lower the value of labor, the increase in productive power must seize upon those branches of industry whose products determine the value of labor power, ordinary means of subsistence, substitutes for the same, and their raw materials, etc. Proof of how competition makes the increased productive power manifest in a lower commodity price. The value of commodities is in inverse ratio to the productivity of labor. That's very important to remember. The more productive you can make your labor, the less socially necessary labor time they need to make it, the lower the value of the commodity. As is also the value of labor power, because it depends on the price of commodities. Relative value, on the contrary, is directly proportional to the productivity of labor. So relative surplus value, right? That's the value that he's stealing from you. That's directly proportional. So the more productive he can make you as a worker, the more value he can take for himself. So there you go. Under capitalism, that's another push and pull. The more productive you're made in your workplace, which should actually benefit humanity, actually goes towards benefiting fucking Jeff Bezos. Fuck that baldy. Is that mean to say? Is that wrong to say that he's bald? Anyways, is he bald on purpose? Oh my god. Does he shave his head? Is that like a choice of his? Or is he like naturally bald? Anyways, it doesn't matter. The capitalist is not interested in the absolute value of commodities, but only in the surplus value incorporated in them, right? So a capitalist is not, the capitalist goal is just to get surplus value from his workers, right? It doesn't matter. The commodity itself doesn't matter, right? All that matters under capitalism is exchange value, right? Nothing else really matters. In the relation with the worker, all that matters is extracting their surplus value. Nothing else matters, right? So that's what he's basically saying. It's a social relation. You must understand every single commodity holds within it a social relation, and a social relation is the exploitation of a worker whose surplus value is taken by a capitalist. Realization of surplus value implies refunding of the value advance, since according to page 299, the same process of increasing productive power lowers the value of commodities and increases the surplus value contained in them. It is clear why the capitalist, whose sole concern is the production of exchange value, continually strives to depress the exchange value of commodities. Hence, in a capitalist production... So right there, he said it. Well, why on earth would a capitalist, whose main goal is to get as much value as he can out of the commodity, why would he actually be incentivized to lower the cost of the commodity? Well, not only can he sell it on the market for a lower price, which offsets the value lost, right? So if a table was $400, he figures out how to make a table in half the price, it goes to $200. Not only can he sell more tables and offset that cost, he can also pay the worker who made the table a lot fucking less. Remember, a table artisan who takes 8 hours versus some schmuck on a assembly line who just puts one leg in every 2 minutes, right? The schmuck gets paid 2 cents an hour. The craftsman gets paid $1,000 an hour, right? So there you go. It's a contradictory thing. Hence, in the capitalist mode of production, Economizing labor through developing productive power by no means aims at shortening the workday. The latter may even be lengthened. We may read, therefore, in economists of the stamp of McCulloch, Orr, Sr., and Tutani Quante, on one page that laborer who owes a debt of gratitude to capital for developing the productive forces, and on the next page that he must prove his gratitude by working in the future for 15 hours instead of 10. Right? So this happens all the time, right? The Google CEO came out recently, well, the ex-Google CEO, and he said, we're done with the 8-hour workday. Workers really need to start getting used to the idea of 12-hour workdays, right? Like, this happens all the time. We're promised that, oh my God, we're creating such an amazing world for you through AI or, these new productive forces, but also you're going to have to work a lot more. The object of this development of productive forces is only to shorten necessary labor time and to lengthen the labor for the capitalist. So basically, under capitalism, technological advances, it helps out the capitalist class. It doesn't help out us, the working class. Its main goal is to lower the wages of the working class. Its main goal, technological advances, is to lower the amount of wages that the workers can demand, not actually to improve our lives. And that is a possible reason as to why productivity has not kept up within America with wages. There is also the fact that productivity is very often counted as companies exporting their labor to factories in the global south. And so that counts as an increase in productivity because it's not technically within America and they pay the workers a lot less. So that's sometimes how productivity is measured. So it's not a one-to-one, but it can, even though it can make sense for you, even though, we have computers now and we're able to do work at a lot faster rate, our wages have still remained stagnant. You can see that in that way. And we still work an 8-hour workday, even though we have computers. I mean, what bullshit, really. 2, cooperation. Humans have always worked together. Under capitalism, cooperation has become very different because humans, for the first time, began being employed in large factories under capitalists, whereas before, labor power might be spread out amongst slave owners, it might be spread out against feudal lords. For the first time, capitalism centralized human cooperation. Since humans' earliest foundations, it centralized it, and it also created the relationship of capital, in the sense that there were people at the bottom who were wage laborers who didn't own any means of production, and therefore the only thing they could do in order to survive was sell their labor power on the market, their ability to work in the form of wages, and capitalists who owns the means of production and bought that labor power, right? So this shifted from a quantitative change, right? A capitalist starts hiring out worker after worker after worker, and suddenly there's this very centralized worker under capitalist, to a qualitative change. That is the system of capital. Money, commodity, more money. And the commodity in this relationship was human labor power, or you as the worker were the commodity. And in this sense, cooperation has created a social tool of control called capital, which capitalists wield over us, right? According to page 288, capitalist production requires an individual capital big enough to employ fairly large numbers of workers at a time. Only when he himself is wholly released from labor does the employer of labor become a full-grown capitalist. The activity of a large number of workers at the same time in the same field of work for the production of the same kind of commodity under the command of the same capitalist constitutes historically and logically the starting point of the capitalist production. Right? So this is a very specific historical moment that is different from other moments. Before, people would be employed by noblemen on fiefdoms, right? And the work was very spread out. It's very qualitatively different. And then before that, people were employed as slaves under the slave mode of production. At first, therefore, there is only a quantitative difference compared to the past, when few laborers were employed by one employer. But a modification takes place. The large number of laborers already guarantees that the employer gets real average labor, which is not the case with the small master, who must pay the average value of the labor nonetheless in the case of small production. The inequalities are compensated for society at large, but not for the individual master. Thus, the law of production of surplus value is fully realized for the individual producer only when he produces as a capitalist and sets many laborers to work at the same time, hence from the outset, the average social labor. So he goes from employing many people to, which is a quantitative change, right, a change in the number of people that he hires, to suddenly a qualitative change, a whole different mode of production, because suddenly he is able to get surplus value out of them. Suddenly he is able to create the capital circuit. Moreover, economy in means of production is achieved through large-scale operation alone. Less transfer of value to the product by constant capital components arises solely from their joint consumption in the labor process of many workmen. That is how the instruments of labor acquire social character before the labor process itself does so. Up to this time, merely similar processes side by side. The economy in the means of production is to be considered here only insofar as it cheapens commodities and thus lowers the value of labor. The extent to which it alters the ratio of surplus value to total capital advance, C plus V, will not be considered until Book 3. This splitting up is quite in keeping with the spirit of the capitalist production, since it makes the working conditions confront the worker independently. Economy in means of production appears to be a distinct operation, which does not concern him, and has therefore no connection with methods by which the productivity of labor power consumed by the capitalist is increased. The form of labor of many persons methodologically working together and alongside one another is the same production process or related processes is called cooperation. The sum total of the mechanical forces of individual workers differs substantially from potential mechanical force developed when many hands act together at one time in the same undivided operation, lifting weights. Cooperation from the very start creates a productive power that is in itself a mass power. Furthermore, in most productive work, mere social contact creates a spirit of emulation, which raises the individual efficacy of each, so that 12 workers turn out more work in a joint working day of 144 hours than 12 workers in 12 distinct working days, or one worker in 12 successive days. Although many may be doing the same or similar things, the individual labor of each may still represent a different phase of the labor process, chains of persons passing something along, whereby cooperation once again saves labor. Likewise, when a building is started from several sides at once, the combined worker or collective worker has hands and eyes before and behind, and is to a certain degree omnipresent. In complicated labor processes, cooperation permits the special process to be distributed and done simultaneously, thus shortening the labor time for manufacture of the whole product. In many spheres of production, there are critical periods when many workers are needed, harvesting, herring catches, etc. Here, only cooperation can be of aid. On the one hand, cooperation extends the field of production and thus becomes a necessity for work requiring great spatial continuity of the working arena, drainage, road building, dam construction, etc. On the other hand, it contracts the area by concentrating the workers in one workplace, thus cutting down costs. In all these forms, cooperation is the specific productive power of the combined working day, social productive power of labor. The latter arises from cooperation itself, in systemic joint work with others. The worker sheds his individual limitations and develops the capabilities of his species. Right, so by working together, people are able to overcome their individual limitations. That much is obvious. Now, wage laborers cannot cooperate unless the same capitalist employs them simultaneously, pays them, and provides them with the instruments of labor. Hence, the scale of cooperation depends upon how much capital a capitalist has. The requirement that a certain amount of capital be present to make its owner a capitalist now becomes the material condition for the conversion of the numerous dispersed and independent labor processes into a combined social labor process. Right, so you can see the quantity, the number of workers that a capitalist hires out suddenly transforming himself qualitatively into the capitalist, them as laborers, them getting the surplus value taken, him as the capitalist taking the surplus value. It creates a tool, a social tool of control. In a like manner, capitalist command over labor was, up to now, only the formal result of the relation between the capitalist and the laborer. Now it is the necessary prerequisite for the labor process itself. The capitalist represents the combination in the labor process. In cooperation, control of the labor process becomes the function of capital, and as such, it acquires specific characteristics. In accordance with the aim of capitalist production, the greatest possible self-expansion of capital, this control is at the same time the function of the greatest possible exploitation of a social labor process, and hence involves the inevitable antagonism between exploiter and exploited. Moreover, control of proper utilization of instruments of labor. Finally, the connection between the various workers' functions lies outside them, in capital, so that their own unity confronts them as capitalist authority and as an outside will. Capitalist control is thus twofold. One, a social process for producing a product, and two, a process of self-expansion of capital. And in its forms, despotic. This despotism now evolves its own peculiar forms. The capitalist, just relieved from actual labor himself, now hands over immediate supervision to an organized band of officers and non-coms, so basically bosses, managers, people like that. And managers technically are, I know I've been saying, your boss is your enemy and things like that. Managers technically are workers. They're just middlemen. They're just middlemen that represent the capitalist class, who themselves are wage laborers of capital, right? So Marx just said it for me. Or Engels. In slavery, the economists count these supervisions expenses as fa fras, but in capitalist production, they bluntly identify control so far as it arises from the nature of the social process. The leadership of industry becomes the attribute of capital, just as in feudal times the functions of general and judge were attributes of landed property. The capitalist buys 100 individual labor powers and gets, in return, a combined labor power of 100. He does not pay for combined labor power of 100. When the laborers enter the combined labor process, they already cease to belong to themselves. They are incorporated in capital. Thus, the social productive power of labor appears as the productive power immanent in capital. Examples of cooperation among the ancient Egyptians: primitive cooperation at the beginnings of civilization among hunting peoples, nomads, or in Indian-based communities is based on 1. Common ownership of the means of production, and 2. On the natural attachment of the individual to the tribe and the primeval community. So what they're saying is cooperation for the labor process has always existed. However, cooperation under capitalism was transformed into a social relation in which a few private individuals owned the means of production and the vast majority of humanity was deprived of them, and so thus they are exploited. Whereas under ancient human societies, or what we might call, what was colloquially then called primitive, what we will nowadays much more graciously call Neolithic. A lot of the Native American tribes that we think of are not necessarily Neolithic cultures, they're post-agricultural societies. These people lived under a system in which everything was for the tribe. There was no private property. Everything was shared amongst the tribe. Whatever they had, they shared. And so it was a sort of a primitive form of communism. So even, and it is dubbed that so by Marx himself. Marx and Engels themselves called this primitive communism. And in that, cooperation was done for the good of the entire community. Whereas cooperation under capitalism is done for the good of the capital circuit and the capitalists. And he wields that cooperation as a force of social control. The sporadic cooperation in antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the modern-day colonies is based upon the direct rule of violence, mostly slavery. Capitalist cooperation, on the contrary, supposes the free wage laborer. Historically, it appears in direct opposition to the peasant economy and independent handicrafts, whether in guilds or not, and in this connection as a historical form peculiar to distinguishing the capitalist production process. It is the first change experienced by the labor process when subjected to capital. Thus, here at once, 1. The capitalist mode of production presents itself as a historical condition for the transformation of the labor process into a social process, and 2. This social form of the labor process presents itself as a method of capital labor more profitable by increasing its productivity. Cooperation, as considered so far in its elementary form, coincides with production on a larger scale, but it does not constitute a fixed form characteristic of a particular epoch of capitalist production, and it still exists today when capital operates on a large scale without division of labor or machinery playing an important part. Thus, although cooperation is a basic form of the whole capitalist production, its elementary form appears as a particular form alongside its more developed forms. The division of labor. The division of labor under capitalism was a very unique process to the capitalist mode of production, whereas before, all throughout humanity, artisans have been involved in almost every piece of the production process, right? A shoemaker would make a shoe from the very beginning to the end. He would make the sole, the leather, he would knit it together. What capitalism did was it divided labor on the assembly machine and made it one part. I put in the sole, he puts in the laces, etc., etc. And this was part of the alienation of capitalism. In fact, division of labor itself is one of the earliest Marx and Engels found earliest indicators of class society. And labor was divided before this. In addition to that, right? But having these roles was one of the earliest indicators of class society, especially as humanity started having agricultural surpluses. Well, suddenly I can do poetry while people farm because, now we have food, right? We have extra food. And so what is important about division of labor is, first of all, under capitalism, and second of all, in general as a form of class society, is that when capitalism transforms into its opposite, which is socialism, that will be the beginning of the end of division of labor. As we know, capitalism has allowed, through its innovative processes, so much advancement, so much the basis for advancement, the basis for a post-scarcity world, the basis for automation, that under socialism, which, this does require a large amount of automation and breakthroughs in industry that even we have not achieved within our modern day. So take that with a grain of salt. Under socialism, right, the highest stages of socialism, you could say, the division of labor itself will break down, and labor as a concept will break down. People will do things out of joy rather than being enforced to do it by society. That will be part of the end of class society itself. So this is a long ways in the future, but you could sort of think of a Jetsonian society, except they have to do work in Jetsons. Fuck. You can think of a sort of Star Trek-esque society with replicators. This is far into the future. This is not now. Anyways, the division of labor is part of alienation of class society and the enforcement of work. That's all you need to know. And also under capitalism, it led to a hyper division of labor, which has particularly led to a deeper form of alienation, as humans have been stripped of their skills, right? So that craftsman shoemaker was a very skilled worker. I don't know how to make a shoe. Not even the people in shoe factories know how to make the shoe. All they know how to do is just put the laces in the shoe or hit the button on the machine that adds the sole to the shoe. All right. Manufacture, the classic form of cooperation based on the division of labor, prevails from about 1550 to about 1770. It arises, one, either through the assemblage of different crafts, each of which performs a detail operation. Example given, vehicle building, whereby the individual craftsman very soon loses his ability to pursue his whole handicraft. On the other hand, doing his detail work so much better, and thus the process is converted into the division of the whole operation into its component parts. Or two, many craftsmen doing the same or similar work are united in the same factory, and the individual process, instead of being performed successively by one worker, are gradually separated and done simultaneously by several workers. needles, etc. Instead of being the work of one artificer, the product is now the work of a union of artificers, each of whom performs only a detail operation. In both cases, their result is a productive mechanism whose organs are human beings. Their work retains a handicraft nature. Each detailed process through which the product goes must be performable by hand. Hence, any really scientific analysis of the production process is excluded. Each individual worker is completely chained to a detail function because of its handicraft nature. So this work transformed into its opposite. Craftsmen go from serving the labor process to, the labor process goes from serving craftsmen and human beings to human beings serving the labor process itself as they are stripped of their skills, right? So you can see this in another form of the social relation of capital through its the way it has divided labor. In this way, labor is saved as compared to the craftsman, and this is increased still more by transmission to succeeding generations. Thus, the division of labor in manufacture corresponds to the tendency of former societies to make a trade hereditary, castles, guilds, etc. Subdivision of tools through adaptation to the various partial operations, 500 kinds of hammers in Birmingham. Manufacture, considered from the standpoint of its total mechanism, has two aspects, either merely mechanical assembly of independent detail parts, like a watch, or a series of related processes in one workshop, again the needle. In a manufacture, each group of workers supplies another with its raw material. Hence, the basic condition is that each group produces a given quantum in a given time. Thus, a continuity, regularity, uniformity, and intensity of labor of a quite different kind are created than in cooperation proper. Thus, here we have a technical law of the production process, that labor be socially necessary labor. The inequality of the time required for the individual operations makes it necessary that different groups of workers be of different size and number. In the type of founding, 4 founders and 2 breakers to 1 rubber. Thus, manufacture sets up a mathematically fixed ratio for the quantitative extent of several organs of the collective worker, and the production can be expanded only by employing an additional multiple of the whole group. Moreover, only after a definite level of production has been reached does it pay to make certain functions independent, supervision, transporting the products from place to place, etc. Combination of various manufacturers into united manufacturer also occurs, but as yet it always lacks technical unity, which arises only with machinery. Machines appear in manufacture at an early date, sporadically, grain and stamping mills, etc., but only as something subordinate. The chief mastery of manufacture is the combined collective worker, who possesses as much a high degree of perfection than the old individual craft worker, and in whom all the imperfections, such as are often necessarily developed in detail worker, such as perfection. Manufacturer evolves differences amongst these detail workers, skilled and unskilled, and even complete hierarchy of workers. So you can see the division of workers happening, right? You suddenly you have all these people working under capitalism. You strip them of their skills under the process. You know, a handicraftsman who makes a shoe, and the whole process is gone now. And now you can start dividing up workers. You can have managers. You can have skilled workers and unskilled workers, and et cetera, et cetera. Division of labor. 1. General, into agriculture, industry, shipping. 2. Particular, into species and subspecies. 3. In detail, in the workshop. The social division of labor also develops from the different starting points. 1. Within the family and the tribe, the natural division of labor according to sex and age, plus slavery through violence against neighbors, which extends it. 2. Different communities according to location, climate, level of culture, turn out different products which are exchanged, where these communities come in contact. Right, so this is the older form of division of labor, pre-capitalist. Exchange with foreign communities is then one of the chief means of breaking off the natural association of the community itself through further development of the natural division of labor. So this is how labor was originally divided. Division of labor in manufacture, thus, presupposes a certain degree of development of the social division of labor. On the other hand, it develops the latter further, as in the territorial division of labor. For all that, there is always this difference between social division of labor and division of labor in manufacture, that the former produces commodities, whereas the latter detail worker does not produce commodities. Hence, concentration and organization in the latter, scattering the disorder of competition in the former. So what they're basically saying here is that under capitalism, there are still some jobs that produce the entire commodity, right? Farmers produce the entire grain. Baker, there are still some bakers under capitalism. They produce the entire loaf of bread. However, there's also workers that do not produce the entire commodity. They have been broken up along the process, right? A worker in a bread factory only puts the flour into the machine, and then the other one cuts the bread. Well, not anymore, but you can imagine it happening. And in that sense, what this leads to is the despotism of the factory floor, the anarchy of the market. This leads to a leverage of social control because these workers are no longer skilled, because work is divided amongst them. It precludes a social relation with the capitalists on top and workers on the bottom selling their wage labor, and in a sense of control under a capitalist. Earlier organization of Indian communities, the Guild, whereas in all these exists division of labor in society, division of labor manufacture, so this is again the factory floor, is a specific creation of the capitalist mode of production. As in cooperation, the function of the working organism is a form of the existence of capital in manufacture as well. Hence, the productive power arising from the combination of work or of laborers appears to be the productive power of capital. But whereas cooperation leaves the individual's mode of working on the whole unchanged, manufacture revolutionizes it, cripples the worker, unable to make a product independently. He is now a mere appendage of the capitalist workshop. The intellectual faculties of labor disappears as far as the many are concerned, to expand in scope for the one. It is the result of the division of labor in manufacture that the laborers are brought face to face with the intellectual potencies of the labor process as the property of another and as a ruling power. This process of separation, which begins as early as cooperation and develops into manufacture, is completed in modern industry, which separates science as an independent productive force from the labor process and presses it into the service of capital. Illustrative quotations. Manufacture is one aspect of a definite organization of social labor, is in another only a particular method of begetting relative surplus value. Historical significance, Iberum. Obstacles to the development of manufacture, even during its classical period, are limitations of the number of unskilled workers, owing to the predominance of the skilled. Limitation of the work of women and children, owing to men's resistance. The insistence on the laws of apprenticeship up to recent times, even whereas superfluous, continual insubordination of the workers, since the collective workers, as yet, possess no framework independent of workers, immigration of workers. Besides, manufacture itself was unable to revolutionize the whole social process, or even merely to dominate it. Its narrow technical basis came into conflict with the production process requirement that it had created. The machine became necessary. The manufacturer had already learned how to make it. Machinery all throughout history has been promised to shorten the working day to make lives easier. However, because humanity has always lived under class society, aside from primitive communism, the vast majority of civilized human history has been under class society. The introduction of new modes of production and new machines has in fact led to the further exploitation of humanity and is no different under capitalism, in which machines, which represent constant capital as opposed to variable capital, which is used to hire out human labor, replace workers and also have the effect of lengthening the worker's workday. Why is that? That is for two reasons. First of all, Human labor power, human value, is taken through the form of surplus value taken from variable capital, right? The capital that a capitalist uses to hire the human workers, and is transformed into constant capital, the machines of production, the means of production, the automatons of production. However, the thing is, as capitalists and capitalism creates more and more innovations and faster ways to make commodities, because capitalism is a competitive adventure, so capitalists are always looking to want to get up on one each other. It replaces human labor, right? Because these automatons get more efficient than individual workers making these things. However, because these automatons cannot create value themselves, because the only source of value, the major source of value under capitalism, not the only source, is human labor power, they can only impart value onto the commodity. This leads to a falling rate of profit across the entire industry as these machines are incorporated across the entire industry, these new productive machines. It also leads to getting rid of workers because these machines replace workers. Think about AI right now and how it's threatening to throw so many people out of the job. And even though these automatons replace workers and the market will eventually readjust itself, as we are so often told by liberals, the readjustments of the market are anachronistic to the actual needs of human laborers. And so there's always a section of the working class that's unemployed under capitalism because of automation. Machines actually throw people into the grips of unemployment. New innovations, like, for example, think of AI and how much it threatens to throw people into unemployment. And the market does not react fast enough to their genuine needs and their needs for employment. And this reserve army of labor, this army of unemployed people, has an additional effect on capitalism and the capitalists, which is beneficial to them because there's always a section of humanity that is unemployed, unable to get work, and so they're desperate to take any pay. So if you got a union and that union is saying we want higher pay, you just go for the unemployed people who are desperate and want bread in their mouths and are willing to take any pay under any working conditions. And then finally, because machines lower the value of the commodity, capitalists are incentivized to actually make workers work longer because the machines make the production process faster because value is based off of socially necessary labor time or the amount of time it takes to create a commodity. They lessen the amount of time to make it, thus lessening the value. And so in order to offset that value loss, capitalists are in fact incentivized to make workers work longer. So A, machinery as such. The revolution in the mode of production, starting in manufacture with labor power, here starts with the instruments of labor. All fully developed machines consist of 1, a motor mechanism, 2, a transmitting mechanism, and 3, the tool or working machine. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th century started with the working machine. What characterizes it is that the tool is in more or less modified form, is transformed from man to the machine, and is worked by the machine under the operation of man. At the outset, it is immaterial whether the motive power is human or a natural one. The specific difference is that man uses only his own organs, while the machine can, within certain limits, employ as many tools as demanded. Examples given: the spinning wheel, 1 spindle, Jenny, 12 to 8 spindles. So far, in the spinning wheel, it is not the treadle, the power, but the spindle that is affected by the Industrial Revolution. At the beginning, man is still motive, power, and tender at the same time, everywhere. The revolution of the working machine, on the contrary, first made the perfecting of the steam engine a necessity, and then also carried it out. So here we can see the transformation of the opposite. The Industrial Revolution led to this great transformation in the productive forces. It allowed for big behemoths of industry, steam engines, trains, etc. to be created. However, it also led to an issue. And the issue is that tools under capitalism went from serving humans to humans serving tools because these big industrial behemoths could run 24/7. And so workers suddenly had to stay at factories much longer because these machines could outwork them. Therefore, they became appendages of machines rather than machines being appendages of human beings, which is what they've been throughout the majority of history. two kinds of machinery in modern industry. Either one, cooperation of similar machines, power loom, envelope machine, which combines the work of a number of detail workers through the combination of various tools, in this case technical oneness already through the transmission and the motive power, or two, machine system, combination of different detail machines, spinning mill. The natural basis for this is the division of labor in manufacture, but at once an essential difference. In manufacture, every detail process has to be adapted to the laborer. This is no longer unnecessary here. The labor process can objectively be dissected into its component parts, which is then left to science or to the experience based upon it to be mastered by machines. Here, the quantitative ratio of the several groups of workers is repeated as the ratio of the several groups of machines. In both cases, the factory constitutes a big automation. Moreover, perfected to the shape only recently, and this is its adequate form. And its most perfect form is the machine building automation, which abolished the handicraft and manufacture foundation of large-scale industry, and thus first provided the consummate form of machinery. Connection between the revolutionizing of the various branches up to the means of communication. In manufacture, the combination of workers is subjective. Here there is an objective mechanical production organism, which the workers find ready at hand, and which can function only through collective labor. The cooperative character of the labor process is now a technical necessity. The productive forces arising from cooperation in the division of labor cost capital nothing. The natural forces, steam, water, also cost nothing. Neither do the forces discovered by science, but the latter can be realized only with suitable apparatus, which can be constructed at only great expense. Likewise, the working machines cost much more than the old tools. But these machines have a much longer life and a much greater field of production than the tool. They therefore transfer a much smaller portion of value comparatively to the product than a tool, and hence the gratuitous service performed by the machine, which does not reappear in the value of the product, is much greater than in the case of the tool. Reduction in the cost through concentration of production is much greater in modern industry than in manufacture. The prices of finished good prove how much the machine has cheapened production, and that the proportion of value due to the instruments of labor grows relatively, but declines absolutely. The productivity of the machine is measured by the extent to which it replaces human labor power. Assume a steam plow takes the place of 150 workers, getting the annual wage of £3,000. This annual wage does not represent all labor performed by them, but only the necessary labor power. They also perform surplus labor. In addition, if the steam plow costs £3,000, however, that is the expression in money of all the labor embodied in it. Thus, if a machine costs as much as the labor power it replaces, the human labor power embodied in it is always much less than which it replaces. As a means of cheapening production, the machine must cost less labor than it replaces, but for capital, its value must be less than that of the labor power supplanted by it. Therefore, machines that do not pay in England may pay in America, example given for stone breaking. Hence, as a result of certain legal restrictions, machines that formerly did not pay for capital may suddenly make their appearance. B. Appropriation of labor power through machinery. Since machinery itself contains the power driving it, muscular power drops in value. Labor of women and children immediately increases in the number of wage laborers through the enrolling of the family, who had not previously worked for wages. Thus, the value of the man's labor power spread over the labor power of the whole family, i.e., depreciated. Now 4 persons instead of 1 must perform not only labor, but also the surplus labor for capital that one family may live. Thus, the degree of exploitation is increased together with the material exploitation. Formerly, the sale and purchase of labor power was a relation between free persons. Now, minors or children are bought. The workers now sells wife and child. He becomes a slave dealer. Examples, pages 384 to 85 in Das Kapital. Moral degradation. Educational clauses and manufacturers' resistance to them. The entrance of women and children into factory finally breaks down the male workers' resistance to the despotism of capital. If machinery shortens the labor time necessary to produce an object, in the hands of capital, it becomes the most powerful weapon for lengthening the working day, far beyond its normal bounds. It creates, on one hand, new conditions that enable capital to do so, and on the other hand, new motives for doing so. Machinery is capable of perpetual motion, and limited only by the weakness and limitation of assisting human labor power. The machine that is worn out in 7.5 years, working 20 hours daily, absorbs just as much surplus of labor for the capitalist, but in half the time, as another that is worn out in 15 years, working 10 hours daily. The moral depreciation of the machine by superseding is in this way risks still less. Moreover, a large quantity of labor is absorbed without increasing the investment in buildings and machines. Thus, not only does surplus value grow with a lengthened working day, but the outlay required to obtain it diminishes relatively. This is more important insofar as the proportion of fixed capital greatly predominated, as is the case in large-scale industry. During the first period of machinery, when it possesses a monopoly character, profits are enormous, and hence the thirst for more, per boundless lengthening of the workday. With the general introduction of machinery, this monopoly profit vanishes, and the law asserts itself that surplus value arises, not from labor supplanted by the machine, but from the labor employed by it, that is, from the variable capital. But under machine production, the latter is necessarily reduced by the large outlays. Thus, there is an inherent contradiction in the capitalist employment of machinery. For a given mass of capital, it increases one factor of surplus value, its rate, by reducing the other, the number of workers. As soon as the value of a machine-made commodity becomes the regulating social value of that commodity, this contradiction comes to light and drives towards lengthening the workday. But at the same time, machinery, by setting free supplanted workers as well as by enrolling women and children, produces a surplus working population. This is the reserve army of labor, unemployed people, which must let capital dictate the law to it. Hence, machinery overthrows all moral and natural bounds of the working day. Hence the paradox that the most powerful means of shortening labor time is the most infallible means of converting the whole lifetime of worker and his family into available labor time for expanding the value of capital. We have already seen how the social relation occurs here through the fixing of the normal working day. On this basis, there now develops the intensification of labor. At the beginning, with the speeding up of the machine, the intensity of labor increases simultaneously with the lengthening of labor time. But soon, the point is reached where the two exclude each other. It is different, however, when labor time is restricted. Intensity can only grow in 10 hours as much work can be done as ordinarily in 12 or more. And now, the more intensive working day counts as a raise to a higher power, and labor is measured not merely by its time, but by its intensity. Thus, in 5 hours of necessary and 5 hours of surplus labor, the same surplus value can be attained as in 6 hours of necessary and 6 hours of surplus labor at lower intensity. How is labor intensified? In manufacture, it has been proved, pottery for instance, etc., that mere shortening of the working day is sufficient to raise the productivity enormously. In machine labor, as soon as the shortened working day becomes law, the machine becomes a means of squeezing more intensive labor out of the worker, either by greater speed or fewer hands in relation to the machine. C. The whole factory in its classical form. In the factory, the machine takes care of the proper manipulation of the tool. Thus, the qualitative differences of labor developed in manufacture are here abolished. Labor is leveled out more and more, at most differences in age and sex. The division of labor here is a distribution of workers among the specialized machines. Here, division is only between principal workers, who are really employed at the tool, and feeders. This is true only for self-acting mule, scarcely so for the throttle, and still less for the corrective power loom. In addition, supervisors, engineers, stockers, mechanics, joiners, etc., a class only outwardly aggregated to the factory. The necessity for adapting the worker to the continuous motion of an automaton requires training from childhood, but by no means that a worker be any longer chained to one detail function all his life, as in manufacture. Change of personnel can take place at the same machine relay system, and because of slight effort required to learn. The workers can be shifted from one kind of machine to another. The work of attendance is either very simple or is taken over more and more by the machine. Nonetheless, at the beginning, manufacture division of labor persists traditionally, and itself becomes a greater weapon for exploitation by capital. The worker becomes a lifelong part of a detailed machine. All capitalist production, insofar as it is not only a labor process, but also a process for expanding the value of capital, has this in common, that it is not the worker who employs the instruments of labor, but vice versa. The instruments of labor employ the worker, but only through machinery does this perversion acquire technical, palpable reality. Through its conversion into an automaton, the instrument of labor itself confronts the laborer during the labor process as capital, as dead labor that dominates and sucks dry the living labor power. Ditto, the intellectual powers of production process as the power of capital over labor. The detailed skill of the individual pumped out of machine operator vanishes as a tiny secondary thing alongside science, the tremendous natural forces and social mass labor which are embodied in the machine system. D. The workers' struggle against the factory system and machinery. This struggle, existing since the origin of the capitalist relation, first occurs here as a revolt against the machine as the material basis of the capitalist mode of production. Only later do workers distinguish between the material means of production and the social form of their exploitation. So you can think of the Luddites. The Luddites were a group that Marx pointed out within Capital. They destroyed machines because they thought that they were the reason. They were the main issue under capitalism. They did rightfully recognize that machines were the reason that they were being put into the reserve army of labor. But what they failed to realize was that the issue wasn't the machines themselves and the new productivity. It was the relations of production, right? That there's a capitalist. He owns the capital. He owns the machine. These machines can be used to greatly, vastly improve our lives. In manufacture, the improved division of labor was rather a means of virtually replacing the laborers. Digression on agriculture, displacement, etc. But in machinery, the worker is actually displaced. The machine competes with him directly. This effect is permanent since machinery continually seizes upon new fields of production. The self-dependent and estranged form that capitalist production gives the instrument of labor, as against the labor, is developed by machinery into a thorough antagonism. Hence, now the laborers revolt first against the instrument of labor. The machine as a means of breaking the workers' resistance to capital by displacing them. Liberal economics maintains that the machine, displacing workers, at the same time releases capital that can employ these workers. On the contrary, however, so he's explaining the reserve army of labor, what creates it, right? It's so anachronistic to actually people's needs whenever these machines unemploy people, replace them. It's even if jobs do eventually come back, it's never fast enough at a fast enough rate. On the contrary, however, every introduction of machines locks up capital, diminishes its variable, and increases its constant components. It can therefore merely restrict capital's capacity for employment. In fact, and this is what these apologists also mean, in this manner, not capital is set free, but the means of subsistence of the displaced workers are set free. The workers are cut off from the means of subsistence, which the apologist expresses by saying that the machine liberates means of subsistence for the workers. This further development, the antagonism inseparable from the capitalist employment of machinery, do not exist for the apologists, because they do not arise out of machinery as such, but out of its capitalist employment. Shots fired. Expansion of production by machines directly and indirectly, and thus possible increase in numbers of workers hitherto employed, minor slaves in cotton states, etc. On the other hand, displacement of Scotch and Irish by sheep to suit the requirements of woolen factories. He's just describing what happens. People get replaced by machines, and they are put into the reserve army of labor that are unemployed, and they just become reserve populations. So, he's even mentioning like Scotch and Irish, how sometimes this reserve army of labor can be, well, Scotch and Irish are not exactly a race, they're an ethnicity, but I'm just going to say racialized anyways. Machine production carries the social division of labor much further than manufacture did. E. Machinery and surplus value. The first result of machinery increasing surplus value together with the mass of products in which it is embodied and on which the capitalist class and its hangers live on, thus increasing the number of capitalists' new luxury wants together with the means of satisfying them. Luxury production grows. Likewise, means of communication, which however absorb only little labor power in the more developed countries. Finally, the servant class grows. The modern domestic slaves, whose material is supplied by releasing workers of value. So basically, capitalists are able to take value from more productive industries, which are directly producing value, and create workers that don't actually produce value, but more so serve them, like butlers, you can think of. Dissolution of the mysteries and of traditional ossification of manufacture and handicraft by modern industry, which converts the production process into a conscious application of natural forces. Hence, it alone is revolutionary as against all earlier forms. But as a capitalist form, it lets the ossified division of labor persist for the worker, and since it daily revolutionizes the former's basis, it ruins the worker. On the other hand, in this very thing, in this necessary change of activities of one and the same worker, lies the requirement of his being as versatile as possible and the possibilities of social revolution. Agriculture. Here the release of workers by machines is even more acute. Replacement of the peasant by the wage labor. Destruction of rural domestic manufacture. Accentuation of the antithesis between town and country. Remember, one of the big beginnings of class society that Marx and Engels identified was the separation between town and country. And under full communism, that will break down. Dispersion and weakening of the rural laborers, whereas the urban workers are reduced down to a minimum. At the same time, robbing the soil, the acme of the earth, the capitalist mode of production, is undermining the source of all its wealth, the soil and the labor. And wow, Engels ends with a very beautiful environmental critique that is so relevant today. At the same time, robbing the soil, the acme of the capitalist mode of production, is undermining its sources of wealth, the soil and the labor. That is what is happening today under capitalism. We are heading towards an eco-collapse and also a collapse of workers. I mean, we are just overworked. We are fucking burnt out. We are overexploited. It is amazing how they were able to predict all of this during the Victorian era, which is so alien to me and you in so many ways. And yet, so many of its laws and so many effects of its capitalist mode of production are still so horribly relevant to us. What can you say? Marx and Engels were the Simpsons, the original Simpsons, in predicting the horrible things of the future. Or perhaps the Simpsons are the 90s version of Marx and Engels. I'll just end with that thought.